So chapter 25 is obviously looking at the 1960s. There is an awful lot going on here, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in and try to keep this as straightforward and simple as I possibly can. Question one, what were the major events in the civil rights movement of the early 1960s? So 1960 sees the very first sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it's staged by a group of local college students where they sit at a segregated lunch counter, demanding to be served and refusing to leave until they are. This is a simple, straightforward kind of nonviolent civil disobedience, and the success of this and subsequent sit-ins is going to lead to the foundation of a new civil rights organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, more commonly referred to simply as SNCC. This organization included young people, both African American and white, who used nonviolent civil disobedience in order to try to combat segregation. And these kinds of protests are going to spread very quickly because they're modular. They can be adapted to different settings. It could be a segregated lunch counter or a segregated pool, segregated bus stop, anything like that. And it requires relatively little planning and can be staged very quickly. But there is, of course, the commitment to the use of nonviolence and refusing to fight back when you are inevitably assaulted by locals or local law enforcement, as these young men were. In 1961, we have the Freedom Rides. Here, a civil rights organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, tested court-ordered desegregation on interstate bus lines. They are met with violence, and this is going to force the Interstate Commerce Commission, so the federal government, to order the desegregation of bus terminals and to enforce this desegregation. So again, we have that conflict between federal authority and state law, where states are trying to defy a federal court order that had desegregated interstate buses, uh, and the federal government has to step in to make sure that the courts, or excuse me, that the states are actually following that court order, not in defiance of federal authority. Next, in 1962, we have James Meredith's court-ordered admission to the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss. His admission there after a long legal struggle will cause a riot and force John F. Kennedy to send federal troops to quell the violence here. Once again, we have this conflict between federal authority and federal court orders and states that are trying to defy those, which forces the federal government's hand. In 1963, we see an effort on the part of the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King and others, to try to use nonviolent civil disobedience to desegregate the city of Birmingham, Alabama, which was widely considered to be the most segregated city in all of America. These protesters are met with police brutality by the Chief of Police Eugene Bull Connor, who makes use of high-powered fire hoses, police dogs, etc., even attacking school children who became part of the protest. During the Birmingham campaign, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be arrested and put in jail like many of the protesters, and here he will pen his letter from Birmingham jail, which defended direct action as well as the timing of such protest, arguing that citizens have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. The goal of this is to generate national sympathy for the movement by showing the brutality of the Jim Crow system and influencing moderate whites to side with the civil rights movement. And it is successful. So much so, oops, uh, sorry, here real quick, we have a King quote from Letter from Birmingham Jail. He says, "You may well ask why direct action, why sit-ins, marches, etc. Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well timed according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. So again, this Birmingham campaign, because it gets national news coverage, generates a lot of national sympathy. And that's going to include generating the support of John F. Kennedy for a comprehensive civil rights bill. So a federal law that would try to make the promises of the 14th and 15th Amendment a reality and to break down the system of Jim Crow segregation. And it's actually JFK's calls for a comprehensive civil rights bill that's going to lead to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. The March on Washington was intended to support this proposed bill and included a coalition of different civil rights groups and labor groups calling for both racial and economic justice. So not only are they calling for an end to segregation and an end to voting restrictions based on race, but they're also calling for economic programs like a federal works program and a higher minimum wage. So this shows the direct ties between the civil rights movement and economic concerns at the time. Of course, the March on Washington will culminate in Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And kind of a fun fact, I guess, it just so happens that W.E.B. Du Bois had died the night before the March on Washington, and that was actually announced at the march that he had died. Number two, what were the major crises and policy initiatives of the Kennedy presidency? So the Kennedy administration introduces new international initiatives that were designed to promote America's image overseas and to counter communism in this kind of battle for the hearts and minds. Keep in mind that massive resistance to Brown v. Board of Education had been an international embarrassment, and Kennedy is trying to counter that with these new initiatives. This includes the Peace Corps, in which young Americans would be sent to developing nations in order to aid in educational and economic development. It included the Alliance for Progress, which was intended as a kind of smaller form of the Marshall Plan for Latin America by investing in Latin American industry in order to build them up economically and try to help prevent the spread of communism there. Unfortunately, these efforts are kind of marred by Kennedy's failed Bay of Pigs invasion. This was a CIA-led invasion of Cuba to try to oust its new communist government in 1961. So during the Eisenhower administration in the 50s, there had been a communist revolution in the island nation led by Fidel Castro. And in the aftermath of this, the CIA rounded up and trained Cuban exiles or Cubans that had run away from the island during the revolution, trained them and prepared them to invade the island, hoping that it would spark a counter revolution and Castro would be quickly toppled and overthrown. Unfortunately, this predicted popular uprising against Castro failed to materialize, and the Bay of Pigs invaders are quickly captured in an enormous embarrassment for the United States. Now, granted, this plan had been developed, or rather devised by Eisenhower and the CIA, and was executed by a reluctant John F. Kennedy, uh, who did not provide air or naval support for these guys, meaning that they didn't get much more than on the beach before they are pretty swiftly defeated. And this is going to have some pretty negative consequences for the Cold War. In particular, while Cuba had hoped to have positive relations with its very close neighbor, the U.S., this invasion pushes Cuba instead toward closer ties with the Soviet Union, hoping the Soviets could help to protect them from future invasions. And this is what's going to lead us into the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So in 1962, US spy planes flying over Cuba discovered Soviet missile installations there. And as you can see from the map, These Soviet missiles had the capacity to reach just about any point in the continental US, putting the United States under direct fire by Soviet nuclear weapons potentially. In response, JFK ordered a quarantine of the island, which is really a blockade, but he called it a quarantine because a blockade is an act of war, and we don't want that necessarily with the Soviet Union. So we kind of parse the language here a little bit to try to mitigate conflict. Um, but the bottom line is that we have surrounded the island of Cuba with US naval vessels in order to prevent the bringing in of more nuclear weapons and as a way to try to force the removal of these weapons. Kennedy rejects an overt military response because many of his advisors were calling for airstrikes and invasions of Cuba. But he was afraid that this could cause a nuclear war because if we attacked Cuba, then the Soviet Union would rush to their defense, and suddenly we're at war with the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons start flying, and everyone dies. Luckily, there are behind the scenes negotiations taking place between the US and the Soviet Union, and that is thankfully going to end the conflict with an agreement that the Soviets will remove their missiles from Cuba, and in exchange, the United States will remove missiles that we have stationed in Turkey, which is about as close to the Soviet Union as Cuba is to the United States. Furthermore, the United States will forswear another invasion of Cuba. That said, we will embargo them, which lasts all the way up really into the Obama administration. It's also going to lead to a significant easing of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. The world had gotten very close to a nuclear war and millions of deaths in this 13-day crisis. And part of that was because the US and the Soviets amazingly didn't have very many direct lines of communication, meaning that these behind the scenes negotiations had to happen through intermediaries, which delayed a resolution to the crisis. Um, and because there's a delay, that's even more chances for things to go wrong and for missiles to start flying. So we create the so-called Moscow-Washington hotline, or the red phone, which sat in the Oval Office for years. And you could just pick it up, and you had a direct line to the Kremlin in Moscow, and they could do the same thing. That way, we could very quickly work out any disagreements in the future and avoid nuclear war. Both sides are also going to agree to a nuclear test ban treaty in the atmosphere and in space, which begins to limit a bit some of these nuclear tests and at the same time eases tensions between the two as we're not seeing one another detonate nuclear weapons all the time. Now, JFK, in terms of the civil rights movement, was a pretty reluctant supporter. Um, like many whites, were kind of suspicious of it as a radical, perhaps communist movement, especially because of its increasing focus on economic equality. By the way, hey, look, that's A. Philip Randolph. You might remember him from World War II. He was the guy that put pressure on FDR to issue Executive Order 8802 by threatening a march on Washington so that he would desegregate or get rid of discrimination in defense industry hiring. Anyway, so JFK was a reluctant enforcer of the civil rights movement, but he, again, kind of like Eisenhower, typically only acted in order to enforce federal law rather than to protect civil rights for the sake of civil rights. So he gets involved to quell the riots and ensure James Meredith's admission to Ole Miss because that was a federal state conflict. He moves to protect the core freedom riders because that was a federal state conflict. But note that he doesn't do anything to protect activists in violent places like Birmingham or a similar Albany campaign because that wasn't a federal state conflict. So he didn't see any necessity to step in even as local law enforcement are brutally suppressing these protests. That said, Kennedy did, of course, support a comprehensive civil rights bill, at least in part, over concerns about the U.S.'s international image in the context of the Cold War. Keep in mind, the civil rights struggle is an enormous embarrassment in our battle for the hearts and minds of people across the world, and convincing them to choose the American capitalist system as a symbol of freedom and liberty. Kennedy, unfortunately, will be assassinated before the passage of this comprehensive civil rights bill. He'll be assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. And he was assassinated by a troubled former Marine and communist sympathizer named Lee Harvey Oswald. Today, conspiracy allegations persist, especially because Oswald, shown here getting shot, was killed by a guy named Jack Ruby shortly after his arrest. Jack Ruby was another mentally unstable gentleman that ran a local nightclub. He had connections to the mob, but they were incredibly low level connections. Um, Nonetheless, there are a lot of odd things seemingly about the assassination, so conspiracy allegations persist. Uh, and those are kind of fun to look at sometimes, but I would caution you that there is literally zero hard evidence for anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald being the assassin. So there might have been a conspiracy somewhere in there, but actual evidence 50, 60 years on has failed to materialize. So you would want to take any of those conspiracy allegations with an enormous grain of salt. Question three, what were the purposes and strategies of Johnson's Great Society programs? So Lyndon B. Johnson, depicted here taking the oath of office on Air Force One, replaces JFK as president after his death. Lyndon B. Johnson had been a successful congressman, serving as the Senate Majority Leader in years prior, and he was notably a really great negotiator, and he was especially adept at persuading opponents to his side. You can see here he has, among other things, kind of a physical presence that he uses in order to convince people in discussions. But the bottom line is that Lyndon Johnson was uniquely suited to be able to convince Congress to pass major pieces of legislation or big laws. Johnson was really one that held a New Deal vision of government. He believed that big government could solve big problems and provide economic security for people. And he saw FDR as a kind of mentor, and he's going to try to pursue through his big package of policies that we call the Great Society a kind of New Deal that expands on a lot of the promises of that vision of government. But again, he is uniquely suited to pass this kind of legislation. He's just good at creating consensus among congressmen. So he will be central to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. This is that comprehensive civil rights bill that JFK had called for. It's going to prohibit discrimination because of race, religion, national origin, or gender. So while it is ostensibly to help protect the civil rights of African Americans and their civil rights struggle, it also serves to try to protect other traditionally marginalized groups as well, like religious minorities, immigrants, different ethnic groups, women, and so on. It's also going to ban racial discrimination in private facilities that are open to the public. And that means theaters, restaurants, and all sorts of stuff. So effectively, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 will outlaw segregation. Um, Now, in the passage of this, Lyndon Johnson does recognize that this kind of law will likely lose the Democrats the South as part of their voter coalition. And while that does not happen immediately, it will begin soon, and that process will be in full swing by the time we're into the 1970s. There are a lot of white Southern Democrats that are, of course, opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They believe that their party has betrayed them by passing this, and they are going to seek alternatives, first in independent parties, and then later in the Republican Party. In 1964, in the midst of the Johnson administration, we're going to see an event called the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Um, the Civil Rights Act of 64 that is just passed, while it did address segregation, it does not address in any significant way voting rights. So the Mississippi Freedom Summer is a initiative headed by SNCC, CORE, and the NAACP to conduct a massive voter registration drive in Mississippi, the state with the lowest rate of African American voter turnout and voter registration because of disenfranchisement techniques. These activists are going to be met with violence, including the murder of three civil rights workers, two of which were white. And this, of course, is going to generate national attention. So, violence against black civil rights workers does not garner as much attention as violence, in fact, the murder of two whites, but nonetheless. The Mississippi Freedom Summer is going to culminate with the formation of the so-called Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was an interracial delegation that demanded to be seated at the Democratic National Convention as the true delegates of the state of Mississippi. They claimed that the voter registration procedures of the state of Mississippi was only allowing for white delegates and white voters at the Democratic Convention, and that Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, they were an interracial coalition that better represented registered voters in the state of Mississippi, and they wanted to be seated instead of the other official, quote unquote, delegation of the state of Mississippi. Um, so they're claiming that the regular delegation had been elected through fraud, violence, voter suppression, fear, and that kind of thing. Um, so LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president, the head of the Democratic Party, refused to seat them because he was afraid that that would only exacerbate this division between the National Party and their Southern delegations. He was afraid that Southern delegations would actually walk out. And this is problematic because it shows that the Democratic Party is not fully willing yet to support civil rights er, they're not fully behind these civil rights organizations, even though they have passed some civil rights legislation. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson is going to face re-election. The Republican candidate is going to be a guy named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater advocated for a much more conservative vision of republicanism. And this is going to signal a much more conservative Republican Party, alarmed by the big government social policies of Lyndon Johnson's civil rights and Great Society programs. So, for example, he says that welfare transforms the individual from a dignified, industrious, self-reliant spiritual being into a dependent animal creature. So this is firmly rejecting the kind of big government economic security that's provided by Johnson's sort of New Deal vision of government, saying that government assistance turns you into a subhuman animal in some way. Now, Goldwater is going to lose pretty spectacularly, actually. But interestingly, he will carry 5 southern states, which should have traditionally gone Democratic. So this shows the potential for conservative and, in fact, Republican gains in the South moving forward in future elections. Oops.